Taxes, they're older than the wheel and probably as complicated as the instructions for putting together an IKEA cabinet. But while most of us are familiar with income tax, sales tax, and property tax, you might not know about some of the strangest taxes that rulers around the world came up with in the name of, well, squeezing every penny out of their subjects. From beards to salts, and even the very air you breathe, humans have been taxed for just about everything. Here's a look at some of the weirdest taxes in history that'll have you raising an eyebrow and possibly checking to see if your house has any unnecessary windows. Let's paint a picture here. It's late 17th century England, and your home is a bit drafty but bright with lots of windows, letting in fresh air and sunlight. Then one morning, you hear a knock at the door. A tax collector has come calling, but he's not counting your income or land. Nope, he's counting your windows. You're about to be taxed for every pane of glass that dares let light into your home. Welcome to the window tax, one of history's quirkiest, most bizarre, and downright inconvenient taxes. Introduced in England in 1696, this tax was intended as a simple way to raise money without causing too much unrest. But in practice, it ended up leading to some of the most unexpected consequences, like entire buildings with bricked-up windows and even a few health concerns. In the 1690s, England was going through a bit of a financial crunch. Wars were expensive, and the government was looking for a steady stream of income without causing widespread protest. Enter the window tax, which was introduced by King William III. The idea was surprisingly simple. Rather than taxing people based on their income or possessions, the government would tax something visible on every house: the windows. Windows were seen as a sign of wealth. After all, the bigger and grander your house, the more windows it was likely to have. By taxing windows, the government hoped to hit wealthier citizens while sparing the poor. It was essentially a luxury tax of the time. The more windows you had, the more tax you paid. The tax rates were simple at first. Houses with up to 10 windows were taxed at one rate, those with 10 to 20 windows at a higher rate, and those with over 20 windows at an even steeper rate. It seemed like a clever solution, but as with all clever ideas in history, it didn't take long for people to find loopholes. Not everyone could afford to pay extra taxes just because they had a few more windows than their neighbors. So, people did the most logical and cost-effective thing. They started bricking up their windows. They chose darkness over tax. Over time, bricked-up windows became such a common sight that they became a defining architectural feature of the era. If you walk around certain parts of England today, you'll still see these bricked-up windows in older buildings, a lasting monument to the lengths people will go to save a bit of money. In fact, this phenomenon even led to the term daylight robbery, symbolizing how the government was literally robbing people of sunlight. There's debate over whether the phrase actually originated here, but if it didn't, it sure would have been fitting. Bricking up windows was more than just a quirky architectural trend. It actually had some serious consequences. Without enough light and air circulation, houses became dark, damp, and musty. In these poorly ventilated spaces, people were more susceptible to illnesses, especially respiratory diseases like tuberculosis. Doctors of the time started to notice the health effects of windowless living, though it would be years before the full impact was understood. Today, we know how essential fresh air and sunlight are to well-being. 18th century England, people were willing to risk their health to avoid the window tax. If sunlight was going to cost extra, then darkness seemed like the cheaper option. In some parts of London, entire neighborhoods became gloomy and dim, with many residents suffering from bad air in the enclosed spaces. Physicians actually started to advocate for tax reform, citing health concerns. And while their voices weren't immediately heeded, the window tax was a surprising public health issue. Finally, after more than a century of darkness, the people of England had had enough. As public health concerns mounted and protests grew louder, the window tax was becoming harder to justify. By the mid-19th century, the government realized that the tax was doing more harm than good. In 1851, the window tax was repealed, and once again, the people of England could bask in sunlight without fear of extra charges. The repeal was celebrated across the country. Bricked-up windows were reopened, and buildings once again let in natural light. Believe it or not, England wasn't the only country to institute a window tax. France, Scotland, and even parts of the United States adopted similar policies, hoping to capitalize on the tax luxury items trend. In France, the window tax was just as unpopular and led to similar scenes of bricked-up windows and darkened homes. In Scotland, there are records of entire tenement buildings with windowless rooms, all to avoid the tax. These windowless rooms earned the nickname black holes due to their gloomy, oppressive atmosphere. And like in England, these bricked-up windows became an architectural legacy, still visible today in older Scottish neighborhoods. The United States flirted with a window tax as well, though it never took hold in quite the same way. But in each country, the effects were similar: more bricked-up windows, less natural light, and a lasting impression on architecture and urban planning. Today, the window tax stands as a quirky footnote in history, a reminder of the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies. Imagine being a single man in ancient Rome or 19th century England, loving your freedom and enjoying your bachelorhood without a care in the world. You're going about your day when, suddenly, you get a knock on the door. It's the tax collector again, but he's not here to ask about your land, your property, or even your windows. Instead, he's here to ask about your relationship status and, to your horror, you realize that your love for the single life has a price tag. Welcome to the world of the bachelor tax, where governments across history decided that staying single should come with a cost. Whether in ancient Rome, early modern England, or even parts of the US, the message was clear. If you weren't settling down, you were letting society down, and that was going to hit your pocket. The history of the bachelor tax goes all the way back to ancient Rome, where Emperor Augustus first implemented it. By the 18th century BC, Augustus was frustrated by what he saw as a rise in bachelorism and a decline in family values. More specifically, he noticed that the Roman elite were increasingly choosing the freedom of bachelorhood over the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. For Augustus, this was a problem, not just for the stability of the family unit, but for the survival of Rome itself. His solution? The Lex Julia laws, which, among other things, introduced financial penalties for men over 25 who were still unmarried. The message was loud and clear. If you were a Roman citizen, especially one with means, your duty was to marry, procreate, and ensure the continuity of Roman bloodlines. But not all Romans were thrilled by Augustus's matchmaking by tax strategy. After all, bachelor life had its perks, and some men simply didn't want the added pressures of married life. A Roman bachelor could lead a relatively carefree existence, focusing on his career, his studies, or simply enjoying his freedom. Augustus's tax, therefore, was a rude awakening, a reminder that their single status was no longer simply a personal choice. It was now a costly one. Augustus didn't stop at taxing bachelors. He went a step further by introducing social penalties for the unmarried, restricting certain privileges and career opportunities. In fact, Roman bachelors found themselves ineligible for certain inheritances and had limited rights in politics, which was, in Augustus's mind, a sure way to make bachelorhood less appealing. But like any good story, this one has its rebels. Some wealthy Roman men found ways around the tax by keeping marriage-like arrangements without actually marrying, skirting the rules with unofficial partnerships. Others, particularly the poorest men who couldn't afford the tax, simply accepted it as an inevitable burden, while the rich used their wealth to pay it without much trouble. After Augustus, bachelor taxes remained in history's background for a while, until 1695, when England decided to give it a whirl. By the late 17th century, marriage rates were dropping in England, and the government saw an opportunity not just to fill the treasury, but to stabilize society by promoting families. Their answer? The Marriage Duty Act, a tax imposed on every bachelor over the age of 25. The act was part of a broader tax aimed at raising funds for wars, but for single men, it was like a matrimonial nudge: marry and avoid the tax, or stay single and pay up. This wasn't just a tax on being single, though. Widowers without children were also targeted, sending a clear message. A complete household was one with both marriage and children. Some bachelors, rather than accepting their fate, decided to get creative. One common method was to fake marriage, presenting themselves as married in public while secretly avoiding the formalities. Others tried to evade the tax altogether by moving to rural areas where enforcement was weaker, or by setting up informal partnerships that didn't legally count as marriage but helped them escape scrutiny. The bachelor tax didn't end with Europe. In the 19th century, parts of the United States, particularly the Midwest and frontier regions, these areas faced unique challenges. Communities were small, and the pressure to settle down and raise families was high. Single men who drifted into these communities often didn't fit the mold of hard-working, family-oriented settlers. So local governments used the bachelor tax as a tool to encourage them to settle down in more ways than one. In Illinois, for example, bachelors faced an additional tax in the early 19th century, and they quickly became the subjects of local gossip. Widely regarded as wanderers or loners, single men were often met with suspicion by established families. A common saying emerged: if he hasn't married by 30, he's hiding something. Local stories even circulated about single men paying the tax with gritted teeth, only to marry hastily to avoid it, often with humorous and sometimes disastrous results. The bachelor tax was never just about money. It was also a form of social engineering. By taxing bachelors, governments hoped to push men toward marriage, encouraging stability, community building, and the right kind of lifestyle. Society wanted predictability, and married men with families provided just that. Bachelors, on the other hand, were seen as unpredictable, even wild. They traveled more, spent their money differently, and sometimes lived on the edges of society. Communities and even families got in on the pressure game. Bachelors were sometimes the subjects of mock auctions at local fairs, where unmarried women or their families humorously bid on eligible men, making it clear that staying single was a deviation from the norm. Bachelorhood became a point of gossip, and any man who reached his 30s without marrying was eyed with a mix of suspicion and amusement. As societies evolved, bachelor taxes gradually disappeared. By the 20th century, changing social norms and economic realities made marriage less of a societal duty and more of a personal choice. The bachelor tax was repealed in most countries by the early 1900s, a reflection of shifting attitudes toward personal freedom and a growing acceptance of single life. But even today, the idea of the bachelor tax remains a humorous reminder of how society once tried to nudge people into the right lifestyle. The echoes of the bachelor tax are still seen in some cultures where marriage is heavily encouraged or where single people are looked upon, with a mixture of pity and curiosity. You wake up one morning in the year 1705, ruffling your magnificent beard, a symbol of wisdom and masculinity. You're just about to grab a cup of tea when a royal messenger bursts in, scroll in hand, and announces, "New decree from Peter the Great. Beards must go or you'll pay." Yes, this is real history. In Russia, back in the early 18th century, there was a beard tax. Under the rule of Peter the Great, a man's chin became a battlefield for cultural conformity. It wasn't just a quirky tax. It was an attempt to change an entire nation's look, and along with it, the mindset of its people. But why on earth would anyone tax facial hair? And what kind of reaction did that get from the bearded Russian population? Let's comb through the hairy details, deep dive into one of history's strangest taxes. To understand why Peter the Great went all in on this no-beard policy, we need to look at the man himself. Peter I of Russia, known as Peter the Great, was a czar on a mission. He wanted to turn his vast, snowy homeland into a European powerhouse and saw Russia as being, well, a bit behind the times. Western Europe, with its clean-shaven faces and sophisticated ways, seemed to represent the future. Russia, with its love for tradition, beards, and flowing robes, represented the past. Peter spent months traveling across Western Europe, studying shipbuilding in the Netherlands, mingling with nobility in England, and observing the more modern ways of Western culture. He was impressed by the cleanliness and sophistication, or at least what he perceived as such, of the West. So, naturally, he came back and thought, why can't Russia look like this? When Peter looked at his countrymen, he saw a wall of beards, each one a symbol of old Russian ways. Peter, in his all-or-nothing mindset, decided that if Russians were going to look modern, the beards had to go. But it wasn't just as easy as a decree. You don't simply tell an entire nation of beard-loving people to shave and expect them to obey. That's when Peter had a stroke of genius or madness, depending on how you see it. He decided that if people wanted to keep their beards, they could, but they'd have to pay for the privilege. Now, you might wonder, how does one enforce a beard tax? Did they send soldiers around with razors, ready to chase down defiant beards? Not quite, but the system was strict, and Peter knew exactly how to make his beard tax work. First, Peter established an official rate. Different classes had to pay different amounts based on their income. For example, wealthy nobles and merchants had to pay an enormous sum to keep their beards. Townsfolk had a smaller, but still hefty fee. Peasants were permitted to keep their beards for free, but only while in their villages. If they entered a city, they'd have to pay up or face the razor. Once you paid your tax, you were issued a beard token, a literal coin stamp with a picture of a beard and the words, "The beard is a superfluous burden." This token served as a kind of proof of payment, allowing the bearer to keep their beard without further harassment. The token system was actually pretty smart. If a bearded man was stopped by the beard police, yes, they had officials for this, and he didn't have his token, he could be fined or in some cases, forcibly shaved on the spot. Imagine that. You're just going about your day, minding your own business, when suddenly an officer jumps in front of you with scissors, demanding to see your beard license. It's like getting pulled over in modern times, but for the crime of excessive facial hair. The beard tax, as you might expect, caused quite a bit of controversy. For many Russians, a beard wasn't just a style choice. It was deeply tied to their faith and identity. Orthodox Christian men believed that beards were a sign of holiness, a gift from God that should not be removed. To them, shaving wasn't just a fashion statement. It was practically blasphemy. The Orthodox clergy, naturally, were horrified. Some religious leaders called the tax sacrilegious and warned of divine retribution. They saw Peter as trying to sever their connection to God, and that didn't sit well with anyone. One story tells of an elderly merchant who, upon hearing of the tax, declared, "I would rather lose my head than my beard." Defiantly, he kept his beard and continued to pay the tax each year, calling it a ransom for his soul. Men like him viewed the beard as a link to their ancestors and their faith, and no amount of silver could convince them otherwise. But there were others who saw the tax in a more humorous light. Young men in cities began sporting fake beards to make a statement, even crafting beards out of animal fur and wearing them out to get a laugh from the crowd. It was a small, hairy act of rebellion that spread across the country. As the years went by, Peter's beard tax became somewhat of a norm, though it never became popular. Peter managed to enforce his vision of a modern Russia, even if begrudgingly. He continued pushing reforms that changed everything from clothing styles to the military, aiming to push Russia towards what he thought was the pinnacle of European sophistication. After Peter's death, the beard tax continued in various forms under his successors, though eventually it faded away. But Peter's beard tax remains one of the most bizarre and infamous taxes in history, a reminder that sometimes rulers will go to any length to enforce their vision of progress, even if it means waging war on beards. The beard tax raises an interesting question that's still relevant today. Where do we draw the line between public policy and personal freedom? When a government tries to change something as personal as appearance, it inevitably causes backlash. Peter wanted his people to adopt what he saw as a better way of living, but he overlooked the fact that culture and identity aren't so easily shaved away. Interestingly, similar appearance taxes have cropped up throughout history, though none have been quite as memorable as Peter's war on beards. It's England in 1784, and hats are everywhere. Men, women, the wealthy, and the working class alike sport hats of all shapes, sizes, and styles. But as fashion would have it, hats aren't just accessories. They're status symbols, and each hat says something about its wearer. Then, one morning, people get wind of a new law. The government has decided that every hat, no matter how humble or grand, will be taxed. England's about to tax its way through the nation's closets, and it's all starting at the top. Welcome to the hat tax, where your headwear suddenly becomes a matter of government business. Enacted by Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger in 1784, the hat tax was introduced as part of a desperate attempt to pull England out of debt. But while officials saw hats as a quick way to drum up revenue, people across the country saw it as an assault on their personal style. The story behind the hat tax begins with a financial crunch. England had just come out of the costly American Revolutionary War, and Prime Minister Pitt was scrambling for ways to refill the treasury. With money tight and debts high, he began imposing taxes on anything that seemed to have a luxury edge, from wigs to windows. Then he zeroed in on hats. Why hats? For one thing, hats were everywhere, and in 18th century England, they were more than just an accessory. They were a part of the social hierarchy. A wealthy person's hat often stood out from the crowd, with opulent designs and rich materials. Meanwhile, the working class wore simpler hats, often designed to shield them from the elements. By taxing hats, Pitt hoped to target wealthier citizens, while generating revenue from the wider public as well. But the simplicity of the plan was deceiving. With hats being an everyday item, taxing them was like taxing air. It didn't take long for people to find loopholes, and when they couldn't, they got creative. And that's where things started to get interesting. The hat tax was designed with a tiered structure. Instead of a flat tax, the rates varied depending on the type and price of the hat. The more luxurious your hat, the more you had to pay. A top hat, for example, was taxed at a much higher rate than a working man's cap. This structure turned headwear into a financial statement. Each hat was now a clue to the wearer's social standing and tax contribution. For the wealthy, this wasn't too much of a problem. They could afford to pay for their flamboyant hats and saw it as a sign of status. But for those who were less well off, hats were suddenly an expense they couldn't justify. Soon enough, middle and lower class men and women began swapping their more elaborate hats for simpler, less taxed versions or skipping hats altogether. As you might expect, this tiered system led to some ridiculous workarounds. Some people cut corners by removing decorative parts of their hats or choosing unassuming headwear to avoid the higher rates. And in some parts of England, people started sharing hats to avoid paying individually. With every tax comes an attempt to beat the system, and the hat tax was no exception. Soon, an underground hat market emerged, where hat smugglers did brisk business in tax-free headwear. In small shops and back alleys, shady characters peddled all manner of hats to avoid the official fees. These underground hat shops became notorious, and authorities found it hard to keep track of all the illegal headgear trading hands. Some smugglers even went as far as repurposing old hats, selling them as vintage or secondhand to avoid new taxes. The hat black market was booming, and authorities were left chasing elusive shopkeepers and buyers in a bid to catch them. The lengths people would go to for hats were impressive. Some would disguise their new hats to look old, and others wore multiple hats at once to fool tax collectors. This hat trickery became so popular that tax officials were sometimes forced to stop people in the streets and investigate their headwear. But if you think underground hat trades were creative, the legal loopholes people found were even more clever. Soon, the question arose, what exactly counts as a hat? People started to test the limits of this definition, creating all sorts of head coverings that technically didn't qualify as hats. For example, some folks began wearing hoods, bonnets, or elaborate scarves, arguing that since these weren't hats by strict definition, they weren't taxable. In some areas, inventors even got in on the action, designing bizarre headgear that would keep the head warm or protected without technically being a hat. Some records show people wearing stacked cloths, turbans, and even small structures on their heads, creatively skirting the definition of a hat. And these innovations led to further questions. If someone wore a hat on their shoulder instead of their head, did that still count? Officials quickly learned that defining hats was harder than they'd expected, and the loopholes became almost laughable. One famous story from the era involves a certain Thomas Wright, a wealthy merchant with a penchant for top hats. Thomas was known for his dapper style and luxurious headwear. When the hat tax came into effect, Thomas was determined not to let it cramp his style. Rather than paying the tax, he had his top hat specially modified to include a collapsible crown. When a tax official approached, Thomas could simply press the top down, transforming his hat into a flat cap, avoiding the tax on luxury hats. His friends found this so clever that it became a trend, and soon collapsible top hats were all the rage among the wealthy who wanted to keep their hats without paying top tax rates. But when tax officials caught on, They adjusted the law to tax these collapsible hats, too. In some ways, the tax created a bizarre fashion caste system. It reinforced the notion that luxury was for those who could afford to flaunt it, while the rest of society became experts in loopholes and make-do alternatives. By the early 19th century, the hat tax had become more trouble than it was worth. Tax collectors were spending so much time and effort trying to enforce it that it barely turned a profit. And with the rise of new fashion trends and the fading popularity of certain hats, the tax was increasingly viewed as outdated and pointless. Finally, in 1811, the hat tax was repealed, much to the relief of both citizens and tax collectors alike. Hats once again became simply hats, and the black market in headwear quietly dissolved. The tax had been a costly, complicated affair that ultimately served as a lesson in the limits of governmental control over fashion and personal choice. Imagine strolling through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, surrounded by marble statues, grand arches, and the overwhelming scent of urine. In the 1st century AD, Rome's Emperor Vespasian decided to make a few extra denarii by taxing something that nobody thought they'd be paying for: urine. The urine tax, or vectigul urini, wasn't just a bizarre attempt at government revenue. It was a unique window into how the Romans lived, worked, and well cleaned. Because in ancient Rome, human urine wasn't merely waste. It was a precious resource used in everything from laundry to leather tanning. While it may sound strange today, Vespasian saw value in this golden liquid, and he decided that if people were profiting from it, he'd make sure Rome got its share. To understand the urine tax, we have to dive into Roman life and the unexpected uses for a substance most of us flush away. In ancient Rome, human urine was a valuable commodity. It contained ammonia, a compound that served as a natural cleaning agent, especially for clothes. Before modern soap, urine was commonly used to break down grease and stains, making it a prized product for laundries. Likewise, tanners used urine to soften and treat leather, a vital part of their craft. But Vespasian's tax wasn't just about seizing an economic opportunity. It was also a clever way to increase revenue without burdening the Roman elite. Vespasian came into power after a tumultuous period marked by war and political instability, and the treasury was in rough shape. Desperate for funds, he turned to items that ordinary people handled every day. And so, the idea of the urine tax was born. To facilitate his new tax, Vespasian established a system of public urinals where people could relieve themselves. These public toilets were set up in busy areas around Rome and quickly became a common sight and smell. Once the public latrines filled up, collectors would gather the urine and sell it to laundries, tanners, and other industries that had a practical use for it. And here's where the urine tax came in. Rather than charging ordinary citizens directly, Vespasian taxed the buyers, the laundries, the tanneries, and other industries profiting from its unique properties. It was a clever setup that allowed him to target businesses without putting too much of a burden on individual Romans. Once collected, the urine was sold in barrels and distributed to those who knew its worth. These barrels were commonplace in Roman markets, though likely tucked away from the olives and wine. One of the most famous anecdotes from the era involved a conversation between Vespasian and his son Titus, who had some objections to the tax. Titus thought the urine tax was undignified, and he confronted his father about it. In response, Vespasian handed Titus a coin from the tax revenue and asked him to smell it. When Titus hesitated, Vespasian remarked, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't stink. This phrase became legendary, capturing Vespasian's pragmatic approach to governance. For him, it didn't matter where the money came from. As long as it filled the treasury, it was worth collecting. Titus may have found the tax distasteful, but the revenue it generated was undeniable, and it ultimately helped restore Rome's finances. The urine tax wasn't just a quirky policy. It actually had a tangible effect on the Roman economy. It regulated the laundering and tanning industries, ensuring that those who profited from Rome's natural resources contributed to the state. Laundries used to operate with very low costs since their primary ingredient was freely available. But with the urine tax, they now had to factor in the cost of purchasing it, which standardized pricing and brought in revenue for the state. Likewise, leather tanners had to adapt to the new regulations, raising prices slightly to cover the tax. This, in turn, impacted the entire leather market as the cost trickled down to everyone from shoemakers to armorers. The urine tax had a ripple effect on a surprisingly large sector of the Roman economy, showing that even the humblest of resources could be economically significant. Not everyone in Rome was thrilled about the urine tax. For many Romans, the idea of profiting from human waste was uncomfortable, to say the least. The collectors and sellers of urine were often looked down upon, though their work was vital to the city's cleanliness and industry. Working in the urine trade wasn't a respected job. Rather, it was associated with the lower classes, and it had a certain stigma attached to it. But despite the public's distaste, the tax continued for years, and people adapted to the strange reality of urine as a tax commodity. Some Romans even developed a certain dark humor about it, joking that Rome's gold flows where no one dares to go. It became a common saying, kind of inside joke among the working class who dealt with the tax directly. The urine tax lasted well into the reigns of Vespasian's successors, but it eventually faded away as the Roman economy evolved and new resources became available. With the rise of other cleaning agents and a shift away from certain tanning methods, the demand for urine decreased over time, making the tax less profitable and eventually obsolete. Moreover, as the Roman Empire expanded, new resources flowed into the capital, and Vespasian's unusual tax became less necessary. The decline of the urine tax was gradual, but by the later centuries of the empire,